River flowed upstream. The man who returned. There are rules to our world. Unspoken laws etched into the fabric of reality itself. A thrown stone will fall. The sun will rise in the east. And water flows downhill. It is a simple, inviolable truth. A constant we build our lives around. But what happens when one of these fundamental laws breaks? What happens when the world you thought you knew peels back, just for a moment, to show you the horrifying, impossible machinery whirring just beneath the surface? What happens when a river decides to flow backwards? This is the story of the Serenity Woods. It's the story of a search and rescue operation that became a mission into the unknown. And it's the story of Daniel Ashford, an experienced hiker who was taken by the wilderness and then returned. The man who came back looked like Daniel. He sounded like Daniel, but he was different. This is a protocol for a type of wilderness you have never encountered. A warning that sometimes, when you get lost, you don't just lose your way. You lose yourself. There is a pact we make with the wild, an unspoken agreement. We enter its domain, and in return we agree to abide by its laws. Not our laws. Not the neat, predictable physics of our cities and our homes, but the ancient, immutable laws of nature itself. Gravity, time, the flow of water. These are the constants. They are the bedrock of our understanding, the pillars that hold up the roof of our sanity. But what happens when that pact is broken? Not by us, but by the wilderness itself. What happens when the bedrock cracks, and one of those pillars crumbles into dust? This is the story of such a moment. It is the story of Daniel Ashford, and a 5-day hike into a forest that decided one autumn afternoon to rewrite its own rules. To understand what happened to Daniel, you must first understand the man he was before he left. Because the man who came back was a stranger. Daniel Ashford was not a tourist in the wilderness. He was a citizen. At 32 years old, he possessed a level of outdoor skill and intuition that many dedicate their entire lives to achieving. His father, a forester, had introduced him to the woods as a boy, teaching him not just how to survive in them, but how to listen to them, how to read the language of a bent twig, the mood of a changing wind, the story told by animal tracks in the mud. He was meticulous almost to a fault. His friends would joke about it. His gear was always cutting edge, maintained with a surgeon's precision. His pack wasn't just filled. It was engineered, every item placed for perfect weight distribution and immediate access. Before any significant trip, his apartment floor would become a mosaic of dehydrated meals, color-coded dry bags, and freshly oiled equipment. He planned his routes with the dedication of a military strategist, cross-referencing satellite imagery with decades-old geological surveys. Daniel understood respect. He knew that the forest's beauty was a mask for its indifference. He knew that a simple mistake, a misjudged step, a moment of inattention was all it took for the wild to claim you. He was not afraid of the wilderness, but he held a deep and abiding reverence for its power. In the second week of October, 2023, with the Appalachian autumn painting the leaves in shades of fire and gold, Daniel set out for a 5-day solo expedition into the Serenity Woods. The name, like many things in this story, is a deception. While parts of it are breathtakingly beautiful, with stands of ancient hemlock that feel like the pillars of a natural cathedral, the Serenity Woods has a darker reputation among locals and park rangers. It is a place of anomalies, a place known for sudden, unseasonable fogs that can descend in minutes, swallowing sound and sight, turning a familiar trail into an alien landscape. It's a place where experienced hikers have reported their compass needles spinning wildly, divorced from the magnetic north. And then there are the whispers, the old stories told by loggers and hunters, of voices on the wind that seem to carry your name, of a profound and unnerving feeling of being watched from just beyond the treeline. It's a place where people, more often than is comfortable to admit, simply walk into the trees and are never seen again. Daniel knew these stories. He regarded them as folklore, cautionary tales born of isolation and the tricks the mind can play. They were reminders to stay sharp, nothing more. His planned route was a well-known, if challenging, 40-mile loop. It would take him deep into the forest's core, following the banks of a winding, lively waterway known as Whisper Creek, before circling back towards the Eastern Ranger Station. His final point of contact was a text message sent at 8:15 a.m. on Tuesday, October 10th. It was to his younger sister, Sarah, with whom he was exceptionally close. The text included the photo of the trailhead sign and a simple, characteristic message. Into the wild. Phone off now. See you Friday. Love you. Sarah, an art student in the city, replied almost immediately with a single red heart emoji. A simple, loving, and completely normal exchange. It was the last one they would ever have. We can only speculate about the first 3 days of Daniel's journey. Knowing him, they were likely filled with the quiet contentment of solitude and the rhythmic exertion of the trail. He would have made camp each night, cooked his meal, and watched the stars emerge through the dense canopy, feeling perfectly at home. But on the 4th day, something in the world shifted. It was a change so subtle, so distant, that no one could have possibly connected it to the lone hiker in the Serenity Woods. Nearly 100 miles away, at a state university's geophysics department, a sensitive seismograph registered a tremor. It was not an earthquake. An earthquake has a distinct signature violent spike, followed by aftershocks. This was different. It was a single, sustained, low-frequency hum, an almost perfect sine wave that lasted for precisely 90 seconds. It was faint, almost imperceptible, and its calculated epicenter was a point deep in the Earth's crust, directly beneath the heart of the Serenity Woods. A graduate student noticed the anomaly, flagged it, and it was ultimately dismissed by his professor as a likely instrumentation glitch. A bit of electronic noise. It was not noise. It was a bell, tolling from the deep. Prelude. Friday came and went. The sun set, and Daniel did not emerge from the woods. Sarah's initial patience, born from her brother's competence, began to curdle into anxiety. He was often a few hours late, but never a full day. By Saturday morning, her anxiety had bloomed into a cold, hard knot of fear. She called the Serenity Woods Park Ranger Service. By noon on Saturday, the search was on. The initial operation was a model of efficiency. The SAR commander, a man named Henderson with 2 decades of experience in these very woods, established a command post and laid out grid patterns on the maps. Teams of rangers and highly trained volunteers fanned out from Daniel's intended exit point, sweeping the trails, calling his name. Their calls were swallowed by the immense, indifferent silence of the forest. By day 2 of the search, a sense of unease had begun to settle over the teams. They had found nothing, absolutely nothing, not a single boot print that could be definitively identified as his. Not a discarded food wrapper. Not a broken branch or a mark on a tree. It was as if Daniel Ashford, his pack, and all 180 pounds of his physical being had been meticulously erased from the landscape. Scent dogs were brought in. These were veteran animals, capable of following a days-old trail through the most difficult terrain. But they acted strangely. They whined and pulled at their leashes, their hackles raised. They would follow a trail for a few dozen yards, then stop, circling in confusion, sniffing the air with a palpable sense of agitation. Their handlers reported that their behavior grew most erratic near the banks of Whisper Creek. They would approach the water's edge, then retreat, tucking their tails, refusing to go further. The helicopter crews found nothing. Their thermal cameras, designed to pick up the heat signature of a living person, scanned the dense canopy for hours, revealing only the normal heat patterns of rocks warmed by the sun and the cold blanket of the forest floor. Daniel carried a personal locator beacon, a PLB. It was his ultimate safety net. If he were injured or hopelessly lost, a press of a button would send a distress signal to a satellite, giving his exact coordinates. The silence from that beacon was perhaps the most unsettling clue of all. It suggested that whatever had happened to Daniel, it had happened so suddenly that he hadn't even had time to reach for it. The mood among the searchers soured. The professional optimism they had started with curdled into a grim, unspoken dread. The woods themselves felt different. The normal chatter of birds seemed muted. The air grew heavy, oppressive. The searchers began to speak in lower tones, avoiding eye contact. They were no longer just looking for a lost man. They were trespassing in a place that felt actively hostile to their presence. A place that was holding a secret. It was on the afternoon of the third day of the search Sunday. October 15th a veteran SAR volunteer named Frank Turner made the radio call that would forever alter the nature of the search and the sanity of those who heard it. Frank was a retired man in his late 60s, wiry and tough, who knew these woods better than his own backyard. He and his partner had been assigned to resweep a section along Whisper Creek, on the faint hope that something had been missed. His voice, when it came over the radio, was strained. Not with panic, but with a profound, earth-shaking disbelief. Frank, Base, this is Turner. Come in, Base. Base. Go ahead, Frank. We read you. What's your status? Frank. Henderson, you need to see this. I'm at Grid 79er, right on the bank of the creek. Base. What do you have, Frank? Did you find a sign? The pack. Frank. The water. Base. The creek, it's flowing the wrong way. The river was flowing backwards. Let that sentence settle in your mind. Consider its weight, its sheer impossibility. A creek, a tributary carved by the relentless, patient hand of gravity over millennia, had simply decided to reverse its course. Frank Turner's words, transmitted through the crackle of a radio, did not just report an observation. They reported a violation, a quiet, horrifying act of heresy against the natural world. At the command post, the initial reaction was not fear, but rational, professional disbelief. Commander Henderson had spent 20 years in these woods. He'd seen flash floods that made rivers surge with terrifying power. He'd seen optical illusions created by heat and fog. He had never seen a river defy its own nature. His first assumption was human error. Frank was a veteran, but he was also nearly 70. He was tired. Perhaps he was disoriented. Henderson. Frank, repeat your last. Be specific. What exactly are you seeing? The reply came back almost immediately. Frank's voice stripped of its earlier tremor and replaced with an unnerving, resolute certainty. Frank. Commander. I am standing on the east bank of Whisper Creek at Grid 79er.2. I am watching leaves, twigs, and foam drift past me. From south to north, the current is pushing upstream. I can see the eddies forming against the rocks on the wrong side. There is no mistake. The damn river is flowing uphill. Silence reigned in the command tent. Henderson put the handset down and looked at his maps, as if the lines and contours could somehow offer a logical explanation. They could not. Whisper Creek flowed from a higher elevation in the north to a lower one in the south, joining a larger river system. That was a fact as certain as the sun. He picked up the radio again. Professionalism dictated the next step, verification. He dispatched 2 other search teams, Team Alpha and Team Bravo, to different points along the creek. One team was a mile downstream from Frank's position, the other 2 miles upstream. His instructions were simple. Get eyes on Whisper Creek and report its status. The radio silence that followed was the most tense of the entire search operation. It stretched for 20 agonizing minutes. In the command tent, no one spoke. They just watched the radio, waiting. They were a group of people dedicated to logic and procedure, standing on the precipice of an event that had no place in their world. Then, a voice crackled to life. It was the leader of Team Alpha. Team Alpha leader. Base, this is Alpha. We have reached the creek. We are confirming the initial report. The current is flowing north. I've never seen anything like it. A few minutes later, Team Bravo checked in. Their message was the final nail in the coffin of reality. Team Bravo leader. Base, same here. We're 2 miles north of Turner's position, at a higher elevation. And the water is flowing up towards us. It was now an established, verified fact. Along a 5-mile stretch of Whisper Creek, gravity had been suspended. The single, low-frequency hum registered days earlier by a distant seismograph was no longer an anomaly. It was now clearly connected to this event, a symptom of some vast, incomprehensible geological or physical shift deep beneath the forest. The news was contained, kept from leaking to the media to prevent a circus of panic and morbid curiosity. But within the search teams, it spread like a contagion, poisoned the atmosphere. The mission was no longer about finding a lost hiker. It felt as if they had stumbled into a place where the fundamental laws of the universe were fragile, where reality itself was thin. The seasoned woodsmen, men and women who had felt at home in the forest their whole lives, were now openly afraid. Several teams refused to make camp near the creek that night, choosing to hike an extra mile to put distance between themselves and the unnatural waterway. Around their small campfires, they spoke in hushed tones, recalling the old stories, the ones Daniel Ashford had dismissed as folklore. Stories of places where the world was inside out. Places the native tribes had marked as forbidden. The Serenity Woods was living up to its darkest legends. And it was Frank Turner, the man who first witnessed the reversal, who was drawn to make the next discovery. An instinct he couldn't explain, a pull he later described as a feeling of being led, urged him to follow the unnatural current, to walk upstream, which was now impossibly downstream. He walked along the bank, his eyes scanning the forest floor. About 200 yards from his initial position, nestled at the base of a massive, ancient spruce tree as if placed there by hand, was Daniel's backpack. It was pristine. That was the first and most jarring detail. A recent rain had left the forest floor damp, but the pack was perfectly dry. It wasn't tossed or dropped. It was set down carefully, leaning against the tree's trunk. It looked as if Daniel had taken it off his back only moments before. Henderson and his senior team were on the scene within the hour. They photographed it, documented its position, and then, with a growing sense of dread, they opened it. The contents were even more disturbing than its condition. Inside, Daniel's meticulous nature was on full display. His sleeping bag was tightly compressed in its stuff sack. His titanium cookset was clean and nested together. His first aid kit was untouched, but his carefully rationed food supplies for the last 2 days of his trip, Day 4 and Day 5, were still there, sealed in their packages. This was not the pack of a man who had been lost and starving in the woods for nearly a week. And then, at the very bottom, wrapped carefully inside a fleece jacket as if to muffle it, they found the personal locator beacon. The device that could have saved him. The device that had remained silent. The hard plastic casing was cracked, as if it had been deliberately struck against a rock. And the batteries, 2 lithium AAs, had been removed from their compartment. They were placed neatly side by side, right next to the disabled device. This was the moment the search for Daniel Ashford transformed into something else. This was no longer a rescue mission. It was an investigation into an act of profound and terrifying intention. Why would a man, lost and alone in a forest that was breaking the laws of physics, systematically and deliberately disable his only means of being found? Why would he leave his lifeline, his perfectly packed bag, at the foot of a tree on the bank of a river that was flowing backwards? The questions hung in the cold, silent air of the woods. Henderson and his team looked from the pack, to the impossible river, to the dark, oppressive canopy above. The feeling was unanimous. They were not just in the wilderness anymore. They were in a place with its own intelligence, its own agenda. And they were not welcome. They were trespassing. For 7 days, the forest held its silence. For 7 days, Whisper Creek continued its unnatural journey, flowing upstream in defiance of all logic. The search for Daniel Ashford had entered its final, grim phase. The large-scale grid sweeps were called off, replaced by smaller, targeted missions to investigate remote terrain. The mood was no longer one of hope, but of grim duty. The searchers were no longer looking for a man who was lost. They were looking for a body. Hope was a flickering ember, about to be extinguished by the cold, damp reality of the woods. And then, on the morning of the 8th day Tuesday, October 17, the forest gave him back. A park ranger named Evans was driving his truck back towards the command post, his shift over. His eyes were gritty from lack of sleep, his mind numb from days of fruitless searching. As he rounded a wide bend in the road, his headlights cut through the gloom and fell upon a figure. The figure was walking on the edge of the road, moving away from the deep woods and towards the ranger station. It walked with a steady, unhurried, almost placid pace. It didn't limp. It didn't stumble. It showed no signs of exhaustion or distress. Evans slowed the truck, his heart suddenly hammering against his ribs. He squinted through the windshield, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. The figure was wearing hiking clothes. It had a few days of dark stubble on its chin. As the truck drew closer, Evans' breath caught in his throat. It was Daniel Ashford. Evans would later describe the moment with a tremor in his voice. He had expected to see a man on the brink of collapse, emaciated, delirious, covered in the dirt and scratches of a week spent fighting for survival. The man standing on the road was not that man. Daniel was fine. He was completely, utterly, impossibly fine. His clothes, while not cleanroom sterile, were remarkably intact. There were no major rips or mud stains. He was thinner, yes, but not gaunt. His skin was pale, but there were no cuts on his face, no bruises on his arms, none of the telltale signs of battling through dense undergrowth. He looked, for all intents and purposes, like a man who had perhaps spent a single, slightly uncomfortable night camping and was now walking back to his car. He was taken back to the command post. The news, when it crackled over the radio, sent a shockwave of disbelief and elation through the weary teams. Subject located. I repeat, subject is located. He's alive. The command tent, a place of grim whispers for days, erupted in shouts and backpats. It was the miracle every SAR team hopes for but rarely gets. The official story, the one Daniel provided to Commander Henderson and the medics, was simple, almost too simple. He claimed he had taken a wrong turn on the second day when a thick, disorienting fog rolled in. He said he hiked for hours, realized he was lost, and, remembering his training, decided the best course of action was not to panic, but to hunker down. He told them he found a small rock overhang, built a rudimentary shelter to stay dry, and conserved his energy, waiting for the search parties he knew would come. It was a plausible narrative on the surface. It's what hikers are trained to do. But it was a narrative that crumbled under the weight of the evidence. Henderson listened, his face an unreadable mask. If Daniel had been hunkered down, conserving energy, why wasn't he near his pack? He had been found 5 miles from where his gear was discovered. When asked about this, Daniel just shrugged. He said he must have dropped his pack earlier when he slipped, and in his confusion, carried on without it. What about the locator beacon? The one that had been found at the bottom of his bag, deliberately broken, its batteries removed? Daniel's expression didn't change. He looked Henderson in the eye and said he didn't remember doing that. He vaguely suggested it must have malfunctioned and broken in the fall, that the batteries must have popped out. It was a weak explanation, and they both knew it. Finally, Henderson asked the question that had been haunting him for days. The question that belonged to a different, saner world. He leaned in, lowering his voice so only Daniel could hear. "Daniel," he said, "when you were out there, did you go near Whisper Creek? Did you notice anything unusual about the water?" For the first time since his return, Daniel's placid demeanor shifted. It was a subtle change, a brief flicker in his eyes, a stillness that was somehow heavier than his previous calm. He broke eye contact, looking down at his own hands, which rested perfectly still on his knees. "I don't know," he said, his voice soft, almost a whisper. "I don't think I was near the creek." It was a direct, irrefutable lie. His pack, his food, his deliberately disabled beacon, his entire life support system, had been found on its very banks. But Henderson didn't press him. He couldn't. How do you accuse a man you just rescued of lying about something so insane? Your pack was found next to a river that was flowing backwards, in a forest that seems to have swallowed you and spit you back out unharmed. The words would sound like madness. And so the official report was filed. Hiker found in good condition. Self-recovered after being disoriented by weather. The impossible questions were buried under the mundane language of bureaucracy. The story released to the media was one of triumphant testament to one man's resilience and the dedication of the SAR teams. His family, overjoyed and weeping with relief, drove to the ranger station to bring him home. His sister, Sarah, was the first to embrace him. She held him tightly, burying her face in his shoulder, tears of gratitude streaming down her face. But as she pulled back to look at him, to truly look into the eyes of the brother she thought she had lost forever, the relief on her face slowly froze. She saw the same blue eyes, the same familiar face, but the light inside them, the spark of recognition, of humor, of shared history that she had known her entire life was gone. He was looking at her, but he wasn't seeing her. It was like looking at a perfect photograph of her brother, a flawless replica. In that moment, standing in the harsh fluorescent light of the ranger station, surrounded by the sounds of celebration, Sarah Ashford was gripped by a cold, absolute certainty. She knew, with an instinct that defied all logic, that the man who had returned from the Serenity Woods was not the brother who had walked into them 8 days earlier. The shape was the same, the voice was the same, but the person inside was gone. The drive home from the ranger station should have been a celebration. For Daniel Ashford's parents, it was. They were blinded by the joyous relief of a prayer answered, a miracle delivered. They saw their son safe and sound in the passenger seat, and they saw nothing else. But Sarah, sitting in the back, saw everything. Every unnaturally long silence. Every stare out the window that wasn't taking in the scenery, but seemed to be scanning it for data. Every time she spoke his name and he turned to her, his response a fraction of a second too slow, a perfect imitation of a reaction rather than the genuine article. The horror that had taken root in her heart at the ranger station was now growing, sending out cold tendrils into every corner of her mind. The story from here on is largely Sarah's. Overwhelmed and isolated in her fear, she began to keep a journal. It was a desperate attempt to catalog the subtle, constant wrongness that had taken up residence in her family home. Her entries, which she would later share with a trusted few, do not describe a monster from a movie. They describe something far more terrifying: a perfect absence. Avoid wearing her brother's face. Sarah. October 24th. He's been home for a week. Mom and Dad are just so happy, they don't see it. Or maybe they don't want to. It's the eyes. That was the first thing I noticed, and it's the thing I can't escape. They're still blue, still his eyes, but they're flat, like the lens of a camera. When he looks at you, it feels like he's not seeing you. He's just recording. There's no light in them anymore. There's no Dan. The changes were subtle at first, easy for her parents to dismiss as post-traumatic stress. Daniel, who was once the boisterous, funny heart of any family dinner, brimming with stories and jokes, was now profoundly silent. He would sit at the table, moving food around his plate with his fork, but eating very little. He would spend hours in the living room, not reading, not watching television, but sitting perfectly still in his favorite armchair, staring at a blank wall for what felt like hours on end. His stillness was not peaceful. It was patient, the stillness of a predator. Then came the new, disturbing habits. Sarah. November 2nd. His eating has gotten strange. He used to love my lasagna. Last night he wouldn't touch it, said he wasn't hungry. Later, I couldn't sleep, and I went downstairs for some water. The refrigerator door was open. He was standing there in the glow of the light, his back to me. He had an open package of raw ground beef in his hand, and he was eating it, just taking small, neat handfuls and putting them in his mouth. He didn't chew like a person. He was just processing it. The sound, a soft, wet, rhythmic sound. I will never forget it. I backed away before he could see me. His empathy, once one of his most defining characteristics, had completely evaporated. He was a man who once cried during a sad movie, who would spend hours comforting a friend after a breakup. When Sarah excitedly told him she had gotten a major promotion at work, he simply nodded, his face a placid mask. "That is efficient," he said, his choice of words bizarre and cold. When their father was hospitalized for a night with a minor heart scare, Daniel showed no reaction at all. He was a perfect imitation of a concerned son, saying the right words, "I hope he recovers quickly," but his voice was a monotone, his eyes empty. He was an actor who had learned his lines but had no understanding of the emotion behind them. The nights were the worst for Sarah. Her bedroom was adjacent to his. She would lie awake, her ear pressed to the wall, listening. He never seemed to sleep. She wouldn't hear tossing or turning, or the soft sounds of breathing. Instead, she would hear the faint creak of floorboards as he stood in the middle of his room, just standing, for hours. On 2 occasions, in the dead of night, she heard another sound, a sound that made the blood freeze in her veins. A low, guttural clicking, a wet, chitinous, insectal noise coming from his throat. It was rhythmic, complex, and utterly inhuman. Sarah. November 15th. I saw him in front of the hallway mirror tonight. It was late. He was just standing there, but he wasn't looking at his reflection. It's hard to explain. He was looking through it, like the mirror was a window and he was concentrating on something on the other side. His expression was one of intense, focused stillness. And his reflection for just a second, I swear it didn't move when he did. He tilted his head, but the face in the mirror stayed perfectly still. Then it corrected itself. I must have been tired. I have to be wrong about that. I have to be. Even the family's golden retriever, Buster, who had adored Daniel and would greet him with frantic, full-body wags, now seemed terrified of him. The dog would whine and cower when Daniel entered a room. its tail tucked tightly between its legs. It would retreat under the kitchen table, watching him with fearful eyes. It would not take food from his hand. Animals know. They operate on a plane of instinct we have long since abandoned. And Buster's instincts were screaming that the thing that looked and smelled like his master was something fundamentally wrong. Something to be feared. Desperate and alone, Sarah did something she never thought she would do. She went through the old news articles about the search, found the name of the SAR volunteer who first reported the river anomaly, and looked him up. Frank Turner. To her surprise, he was listed in the phone book. With a trembling hand, she called him. She expected to be dismissed as a hysterical girl. Instead, the old man listened patiently. He agreed to meet her at a quiet coffee shop on the edge of town. Frank Turner listened as Sarah poured out her story, the empty eyes, the raw meat, the clicking sounds, the mirror. He didn't interrupt. He didn't look at her like she was crazy. When she was finished, a tear tracing a path down her cheek, he stirred his coffee for a long time before speaking. His voice was raspy, heavy with the weight of memory. "Frank, your brother's pack," he said. It was spotless. The beacon was broken on purpose. The batteries were sitting right next to it. The river, young lady, I've been in those woods for 50 years. What I saw that day was not of this world. There are stories, old stories, that the loggers and the old-timers used to tell, about places where the veil between our world and another is thin. They say the wilderness is older and stranger than we can know. It doesn't just take things. Sometimes it puts things back. He leaned forward, his gaze locking with hers. His warning was a terrifying validation of her deepest fears. "Frank, be careful," he said, his voice low and urgent. "You're not living with your brother anymore." That night, fueled by a new and dreadful certainty, Sarah searched Daniel's room. Hidden away at the back of his closet, tucked under a pile of old sweaters, she found a new sketchbook. It wasn't like his old ones, which were filled with beautiful, detailed drawings of mountain landscapes and wildlife. The pages of this book were covered in something else entirely. And on the last page there was a drawing. It was a sketch of a figure. It was tall, impossibly thin. Its limbs were long, with joints in places where human joints should not be. It had no face, no eyes, no mouth. It was just a silhouette, a shape of pure wrongness, a shape from a nightmare. Beneath it, a single, strange symbol was drawn, one that appeared repeatedly throughout the book. As Sarah stared at the drawing, a sound from the small television in Daniel's room caught her attention. It was the local late-night news. A park ranger was being interviewed about the recent events at the Serenity Woods. TV news reporter. And in a final, bizarre chapter to the Daniel Ashford story, park officials confirmed today that Whisper Creek, which had been exhibiting unexplained reverse flow phenomena, has, as mysteriously as it began, returned to normal. Geologists remain baffled. Sarah felt a cold dread wash over her, a feeling of profound and terrible alignment. Felt, she wrote later, like a transaction had been completed. A door had been opened, and something had been passed through. And now the door was closed. There is a moment when fear transcends itself. When the constant, gnawing anxiety and the sleepless nights of creeping dread consolidate into a single hard point of certainty. For Sarah Ashford, that moment had arrived. The sketchbook in her hands was a map of her nightmare. Frank Turner's words were the validation she never wanted. And the news report of the river returning to normal was a final, terrible confirmation. A transaction had been completed. A door had been opened, and now it was closed. She could not live another day in the unbearable silence. She could not sit at another dinner table across from the polite, empty vessel that wore her brother's face. The not knowing was a poison, and the only antidote, however terrifying, was the truth. She was standing on the precipice of a revelation that she knew, instinctively, she was not meant to comprehend. But she had to ask. She had to cross the final boundary. She stood before him, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs, a drumbeat in the profound quiet. He didn't turn. He remained fixed, a statue looking out at the world as it slipped into night. Sarah. Dan. Silence. The clock ticked. He did not acknowledge her. He was an actor, and she had just gone off script. Sarah. I know you're not him. Sarah. I know what happened in those woods. I saw this. Her voice cracks on the last word. I saw the drawings. What are you? For a long moment, the only answer was the ticking of the clock, each second stretching into an eternity. The room grew colder. Then, with a slowness that was deliberate, unnatural, and utterly chilling, the head turned. The change was not dramatic. There was no monstrous transformation. It was something far more subtle and far more terrifying. The placid emptiness that had resided in Daniel's eyes was gone. In its place was something else, a deep, ancient, and utterly alien awareness. It was an intelligence that was as old as the stars and as cold as the void between them. His posture shifted, an almost imperceptible uncoiling, from the relaxed slouch of a man resting to the focused stillness of a being that was now engaged. When it spoke, the voice was Daniel's, but the cadence, the rhythm, the very soul of it, was foreign. The entity, he is gone. It was not an apology. It was not a threat. It was a simple, devastating statement of fact. Sarah felt the breath catch in her throat, the confirmation of her deepest fear stealing the air from her lungs. Sarah. The river, what did you do? The entity. A confluence. The thing replied, its eyes never leaving hers, its gaze an unnerving weight, a temporary warping of physical law. A doorway. We did not create it. We simply used it. The words hung in the air, freighted with an impossible meaning. The word implied a multitude. The horror expanded in Sarah's mind, from a singular intruder to a silent, unseen invasion. Sarah. We? There are more of you. The entity. We are many, it said. A simple statement that fractured Sarah's perception of the world. Observers. Explorers. Your species is loud. Sarah. Loud? What do you mean? The entity. You broadcast. Your emotions, your thoughts, your fears. Your consciousness is a chaotic storm of energy. It is a beacon in the darkness. We were drawn to the noise. Sarah's mind reeled, struggling to grasp the incomprehensible. Humanity, with all its art, its science, its love and its hatred, was nothing more than loud static to something ancient and vast. She held up the sketchbook, her hand trembling. Sarah. What are these? The drawings. The entity. Not drawings. Language. Mathematics. A grammar for a reality you cannot perceive. It is a map of the keyhole. Narrator. A cold dread, colder than the grave, colder than any fear she had ever known, washed over Sarah. The alien terminology, the casual dismissal of human art and science as a mere keyhole, it spoke of a perspective so advanced, so remote, that it rendered humanity utterly insignificant. Sarah. Keyhole? What do you want? What are you doing here? For the first time since his return, the thing's face moved. The corners of Daniel's mouth turned up into a perfect imitation of her brother's gentle, reassuring smile. But the smile was a dead thing. It was a mechanical motion of muscles that did not reach the cold, ancient, observing eyes. It was the most terrifying thing she had ever seen. The entity. To understand the shape of the lock. And with that, the conversation was over. The entity turned its head back to the window, its attention returning to the darkness outside. Its purpose stated, its audience dismissed. It had not threatened her. It had not been malicious. It had simply laid bare a truth so vast and so horrifying that it threatened to shatter her sanity. She was not dealing with a demon or a ghost. She was in the presence of something that viewed humanity not as a species to be conquered, but as a complex puzzle to be solved. A cosmic indifference more terrifying than any malice. She was standing in a room with a scout, cartographer, patiently, silently, learning the shape of the lock that was us. What do you do when the floor of reality gives way? What do you do when you have looked into the eyes of the void, and the void has looked back, wearing your brother's face? Sarah Ashford did the only thing a human being can do in the face of such a cosmically vast and indifferent horror. She ran. She packed a single bag, leaving behind a lifetime of memories. She took her car keys, her wallet, and the terrifying sketchbook. She crept down the stairs, her heart a frantic bird in her chest, past the living room where the thing sat, still staring out into the night. She did not look at it. She did not say goodbye. She opened the front door, slipped out into the cold night air, and drove away without looking back. She tried to explain. She drove to her parents' house the next day, her face pale, her eyes wide with sleepless terror. She tried to tell them what Daniel had become. She showed them the sketchbook, with its impossible geometry and its drawing of the faceless man. They didn't believe her. How could they? To them, their son had been returned to them by a miracle. They saw him getting ready for work, reading the newspaper, speaking in his familiar voice. They saw a son recovering from trauma, not a vessel for an alien consciousness. Sarah's story sounded like madness, the ramblings of a sister who had cracked under the stress of the ordeal. Her evidence was just a book of strange doodles. Her proof was just a feeling. How do you tell someone that the miracle they prayed for is a monster? And so, the thing that was once Daniel Ashford continues its quiet existence. It lives in that house. It goes to work, pays its bills. It exists, a perfect copy, hiding an intelligence beyond our comprehension, patiently observing from behind a dead man's eyes. It is a scout, cartographer, a presence that is utterly alien, yet perfectly assimilated. And it is still learning the shape of the lock. Sarah never went back. She moved to a different city, estranged from the parents who could not see the truth. She lives with the terrible knowledge of what is sitting at their dinner table. The story of Daniel Ashford is a protocol, a warning. It leaves us with the most terrifying questions of all. How many other doorways like Whisper Creek exist in the wild, forgotten places of the world? Temporary confluences where the laws of our reality bend and break. How many others who have been taken by the wilderness have also returned different? Are they walking among us now, their true nature hidden behind a familiar face? The entity said our species is loud, a beacon in the darkness. We are not the only ones who are listening. And perhaps the greatest danger is not that when you go into the deep wilderness you won't come back. It's that you will. Thank you for joining us here at the Wilderness Protocol. These stories are more than just campfire tales. They are part of a larger conversation about our place in a world that is far stranger, more ancient, and more mysterious than we are often led to believe. They are a reminder that humility and vigilance are the most essential pieces of gear you can carry. If this story resonated with you, and if you believe that there is more to our world than what we can see, please consider subscribing to the channel and turning on notifications so you don't miss our next investigation. And we'd like to hear from you. The foundation of this protocol is shared experience. Share your own strange wilderness encounters in the comments below. Every story is a piece of the map. We read them all, Until next time, stay safe and stay vigilant.